This is a production of World Video Bible School. To God be the glory.
On our chapter about the development and history of the Old Testament canon, we're talking about the writings, the third section of the Hebrew division of the Old Testament. We just looked at the twofold division, and that is the one that was canonized. That's the way they had it divided when the canonization of the Old Testament took place. But later on, they decided to divide the Old Testament into three different categories. And we're going to look now at that point on page 244 that says, subsequent threefold classification. Subsequent threefold classification in the middle of page 244. By the 2nd century BC, there had come a threefold classification. There really is no known reason why. We can observe some things about that, and so in our textbook there are a number of points that we want to look at as to why this threefold classification may have come about. The first one is on page 244, and that is that it's perhaps because there was thinking at the time that there was a difference between those who had the prophetic office as opposed to those who had the prophetic gift. But you see, the problem with that is listed for us about 7 lines down when it says, one problem with this view is that there is no evidence that every book in the prophets was written by someone with the prophetic office. So that probably is not a good explanation as to why the threefold division came. At the bottom of this page and the top of the next is a second observation as to why they did. They thought perhaps, well, if it was not written by a prophet, maybe it really isn't canonical, so maybe we'd better separate those books. And if you look about the 5th line down from the top of page 245, you'll see the problem with that. There is no evidence that the writings were considered uncanonical, meaning the category of those in the writings, not just any writings, but the group of the books that were in the writings. Some books always held to be canonical, such as Psalms and Daniel, were placed in the writings section. So that isn't a valid reason for categorizing them in the threefold. So let's look at the third one. Now, we need to look at this one in some detail. This one has to do with higher critics, those that criticize the Bible, do not believe in inspiration anyway, but read it with me. The view of most higher critical scholars that these books were placed in the canon at a late date because they were not written and are accepted until that late date does not square with the established facts and dates for many of the writings. The Davidic Psalms, Proverbs, around 1000 BC or so, nor does it fit with the fact that Josephus had only 4, rather than the 11 as we now do in that division, books listed in that section. The later Talmud is the first one to really, of the Jewish listings, is the first one to do that. Josephus placed Daniel among the prophets rather than the writings. That fact not only belies the late date, in other words, says that it could not have been the late date. Higher critical scholars usually ascribe to Daniel. Many times Daniel is thought to have been written about 165 BC. But this shows that Daniel had already been written and canonized before that. Then number 4, and therefore that could not be a good reason for saying that they were divided into 3 sections. The 4th possible reason is that this later threefold classification of the Old Testament came because they used a number of the books that are listed in that category in some of their festivities, some of their feast day activities. They're called festal significance. For example, the 5 rolls, and they're listed as one, but the 5 rolls were read at the 5 annual feasts. Now the 5 rolls were Ruth, Song of Solomon, Ecclesiastes, Lamentations, and Esther. And it may well be that they were all on one scroll. But whatever the reason was, that is true that they were read at those 5 feasts, and that's a possible reason. But Beckwith offers a plausible explanation for the origin of the threefold. He says that he believes that the scriptures were done this way, that divided into the things, by Judas Maccabeus. That would have been about 164 BC. And he says, the way he does it is, he thinks that the non-Mosaic scriptures, called the prophets, or originally called the prophets, made into two divisions called the prophets and the hagiographa, which means holy writings, were done during that day for the following reasons. Now read this small quote down here at the bottom. The three sections of the canon are not historical accidents, but works of art. The first consists of the Mosaic literature, partly historical, partly legal, arranged in chronological order. That's the Pentateuch. The other two sections of the canon also contain both, now watch, historical and non-historical books, meaning those that recorded basically history, and then also had others in there, and those who did not have basically history in them. Doesn't mean that the things recorded in them are not historical. It has nothing to do with that. The historical books cover two further periods and are arranged in chronological order. The non-historical books, and he terms them visionary, are oracular. Now, oracular means like an oracle. An oracle is the word that we use to refer to a message from God. You remember Peter said, if any man speaks, let him speak as though it were oracles from God. So the oracular in the case of the prophets, and then the lyrical and sapential, and that means wisdom literature, in the case of the hagiographs, are arranged in descending order of size. Now that is correct. Whether that's the reason or not, we don't really know. The historical part of that is correct. The size is correct. The way they're divided is correct. But we don't know if indeed we can blame all of that on Judas Maccabeus and those people that were around with him during that period of time. Down at the bottom of the page, we do know, whatever the reason for the latter threefold classification, it must be remembered that canonization was on a twofold basis. That is to say, the books of the Old Testament were already canonized back when they were just called the Law and the Prophets. That included the same 39 we have today, the same 39 that would be in the threefold classification. And then the book goes on to say, the law and these divisions actually included all the same books that were later given a threefold classification in some circles, and that finally gained general acceptance among the Jews by, or maybe a little before, the 4th century A.D. So this has been a good while. In Bruce's books on the books in the parchment, or Bruce's writing on the books in the parchment, page 97, it says, it can be taken for granted by this time the first two sections, the Law and the Prophet, contain all the books they contain in the Hebrew Bible we know. But did the third section, the writings, also contain that? And he says, it probably did. Well, let's look at this third section now in our chapter called the confirmation of the prophetic model. You see, we have a number of historical facts that we can use as checkpoints in the overall process of this prophetic model that we have. So we're going to look at the evidence of this later threefold classification. And we're going to see historically where we have evidence for it. First, we'll look at the prologue to Ecclesiasticus. Now, while I'm looking at this, if you want to be turning back to page 24, we're going to read the quotation from Ecclesiasticus, or the prologue, and I want you to see that. So you might want to write over here by the side of prologue to Ecclesiasticus, see page 24 for the quote. But possibly the earliest reference is the prologue to Ecclesiasticus, which may refer to the use of a threefold arrangement of the Old Testament by the writer's grandfather. However, no books are named, hence it is not known which books were in this section. Now, let's turn over there and look at the quotation itself. It's the second paragraph on page 24, or the first beginning one. Perhaps the earliest testimony to a threefold classification, however, comes from the prologue to Ecclesiasticus, which reads, my grandfather Jesus, this is not talking about Jesus Christ, it was, many people were named Jesus. My grandfather Jesus, after devoting himself especially to the reading of the law and the prophets and the other books of our fathers. You see, that would be a reference to a threefold division. That's the earliest possible reference to it. Then if you'll look, the second one is Jesus himself, and we referred to this last time, but in Luke 24:44, Jesus refers to the law, the prophets, and the Psalms, which was the first book in this category. In Lightfoot's book on How We Got the Bible, he says, good evidence, this is not in your text, good evidence exists in the New Testament which show that by the time of Jesus, the canon of the Old Covenant had been fixed. And then he continues, it cannot be questioned that Jesus and his apostles time after time quote from a body of writings as Scripture. If some writings were Scripture and others were not, some writings were canonical and some were non-canonical. So it's very clear from even the use of these categories. It would be just like our saying today, the Old Testament, the New Testament. I don't have to list 39 books for the Old Testament for you to know that that's what I mean. And I don't have to list the 27 books of the New Testament for you to know that those are the ones I'm referring to. And so in those days, they could say law and prophets, referred to the same 39 books, or they could say the law, the prophets, and the writings, or perhaps name one of the books in the writings, and Psalms was the longest book in the writings and the one that had the most prophecies about Jesus, and in the context of Luke 24:44, that's what he was referring to, the prophecies about him. Then we have, back on page 246, we have Philo. Philo was just after the time of Christ. He was a first century Jewish writer, and he witnessed to a threefold classification making reference to the law, the prophets, and then he says, and the hymns and the others which foster and perfect knowledge and piety. Now look down at the footnote there, footnote 23. In Philo's writing, The Contemplative Life, page 127, it says, in each house there is a consecrated room which is called a sanctuary or closet, and closeted in this they are initiated into the mysteries of the sanctified life. They take nothing into it, either drink or food, or any other of the things necessary for the needs of the body, but laws and oracles delivered through the mouth of prophets, and psalms, and anything else which fosters and perfects knowledge and piety. You see, he used the word psalms as almost representative of that third category too, just like Jesus did. So it was a very common expression during the day. Josephus, we've already referred to, but Josephus attested to the same classification at about the same time, latter part of his life, and explicitly stated that the third section was made up of hymns to God and precepts for the conduct of human life. Then notice the Babylonian Talmud, the last one here on the page. By, or maybe a little before, the 400 A.D., the 4th century A.D., the Babylonian Talmud gave the modern threefold classification, the law, the writings, the law, the prophets, and the writings. Thus, the tendency to classify the canon into three sections, which possibly began as early as 200 B.C. and finally became accepted by about 400 A.D. That fact may be further confirmed at other checkpoints in the history of the Hebrew canon at this interval. In other words, what we're saying is there was a division called the law, the prophets, and the writings, and it was the same as the law and the prophets, which was canonized even before Jesus' time. Now let's go to page 247, and we'll be looking at the confirmation of the twofold canonization. We really, in order, would probably have looked at this first, but notice that the Talmudic tractate, that's a writing, Aboth, refers to the men of the great synagogue. Now, the men of the great synagogue were about 120 elders who returned from the exile, and of course the temple was not then built, and so they started the idea, as far as we can tell from history anyway, of having synagogues to worship in. The tradition of the great synagogue is that of those Jewish scholars who followed Ezra in the exposition of the law. It's believed they formed an assembly that was responsible for the recognition and preservation of the Old Testament canon. And there are several lines of evidence that support this. So let's look at this. The Old Testament links them together. And he points out in this paragraph that we've already looked at that, we've already talked about that, and so that was evidence that they were already used as that. Then number 2, the repeated use of law and prophets, not only in the Jewish writings, but also as far as the Dead Sea scrolls in the Qumran community, and of course we've already referred to them in the New Testament. And then number 3 at the top of page 248, they are acknowledged as such in the book of Daniel. There is a statement about the law of Moses as well as a group called the books in Daniel 9, and you can read about that in that. And then Zechariah refers to the former prophets, which also indicates that he was familiar with the line of prophetic utterances. And you can go back to page 240 and see some more on that. We've already talked about that, or you should have read about that already, some back there. Then number 4, acknowledgement by succeeding prophets. Now the real test of this was the succeeding prophets and the authority of their prophetic utterances. Now look at the 4th line down. If there were a gradually developing canon to which inspired books were added as they were written, and we've already shown not with a long delay. They did not wait hundreds of years around to be decided on, but people who received them first recognized they were canonical. It was later people who had problems with them. It is reasonable to expect not only continuity between the books, but some recognition of the existence of the former books by the latter writers. It is unreasonable, however, to expect all the preceding books to be quoted in later Old Testament books any more than each New Testament book that was written later would have to quote all the previous New Testament books. That would not be what we would expect. But we would expect confirmation somewhere, and we've already shown some of that from the New Testament. So let's look quickly at some of these that are listed. We're not going to go in detail here. I do want you to read these. But the first one is that the law of Moses was recognized and utilized by subsequent prophetic books, is evident from Joshua 1:7 to Malachi 4:4. We've already read Joshua 1:7. You can read Malachi 4:4, but there's no question but that everyone recognized the law of Moses. Number 2, the crucial question for consequent consideration is whether or not there is evidence of prophets since Moses' time who are in continuity with and/or have a recognition of the other biblical prophets that precede them. Now, notice the way he has these listed here. He has 6 different things listed. First, he has that Joshua and events in his book are referred to in the book of Judges, so that ties those. Then Ruth, which was originally appended to Judges, refers to the days when the judges ruled, so that ties those. The book of 1 Samuel carries the history of Israel after Judges, and 2 Samuel formed a unit with 1 Samuel in the Hebrew listing and the Hebrew canon. There was no 1 and 2 Samuel. We had all the same material. It just wasn't called that. It just called Samuel. And then 1 and 2 Kings, once again, they're just one book, not 2 books like we have it, but it's the same material. Refer to the law of Moses and repeatedly speak of David as his life is told in 1 and 2 Samuel, tying that to the law of Moses and 1 and 2 Samuel. Then you have the books of 1 and 2 Chronicles, again, that was just one book in the Jewish way of listing it, which gave a parallel history to Samuel and Kings and alluded to former events. In fact, genealogies are traced all the way from the book of Genesis in 1 Chronicles 1, including the one that is recorded only in Ruth. So it ties literally all of the books together. Then Ezra and Nehemiah begin with the same 2 verses that close 2 Chronicles as we have 2 Chronicles. And they refer to the law of Moses and review Israel's entire history as it's recorded from Genesis through the captivity and restoration. Folks, that's airtight. You just have it there in a nutshell. There is no question but that all the historic books go back to the other historic books. And of course the prophets fit into those historic events recorded in those books. But let's look at the evidence that the prophetical and poetic books were also recognized. The date of the writing of the book of Job is unknown. Some put it down during the time of Moses. Certainly it was patriarchal. We know that, but we don't have the exact date. We have in Ezekiel 14 a statement about Job, and so we know that, of course, it was known and recognized and was almost proverbial during his day. We have portions of the Psalms that occur in some of the historical books, for example, 2 Samuel and 1 Chronicles 16, and there is a statement that David spoke by the Holy Spirit in 2 Samuel. Then you have Solomon's writings, and certainly they would be logically included in the list that is mentioned in 1 Kings 4 when it says, he spoke 3,000 proverbs and his songs were 1,005. Well, that certainly would fit into any writings just about that we could have from Solomon. And then you have many of the prophets also quote from or refer to the inspired writings of their predecessors. And you can look at all those. I don't believe we need to read them on camera. But look at the bottom paragraph. It could not be expected, we repeat, that every book of the Old Testament would be referred to by succeeding prophets. The New Testament as a whole does not refer to every book in the Old Testament. It is no more necessary for there to be an explicit reference to every book being added to the canon than to have an explicit claim for its inspiration. And we've already talked about that back in the inspiration section and show why we know that every single book in the canonical listings was indeed inspired, and it's because of the category that it was in. However, at the top of page 250 it says, there is substantial evidence to support the concept of a growing canon. In other words, every time a book was written, that book was recognized as canonical if it was written by a man of God and accredited by acts that confirmed that. And right then and there, as he says, it was received by the people into the canon and preserved. That's why we have them today. And of course, keep in mind that there was a continuation of prophets all during this period of time, inspired people. They would know which books were to go into that Old Testament. And so people began to universally recognize their canonicity. In Bruce's book on the books in the parchment, or called The Books in the Parchments, page 104, he says, for Christians, however, it suffices that the Hebrew canon of the Old Testament was accepted as divinely authoritative by our Lord and His apostles. The apostles, no doubt, found in their master's attitude to these writings sufficient warrant for theirs, and He accepted them, not because their canonicity had been handed down by tradition, which Jesus often questioned of the Jews, but because He recognized their divine quality. And in this, as in all else, we are safe when we follow Him. And then he says, what is indispensable to the Redeemer, it has been well said, must always be indispensable to the redeemed. And so again we come back to the theme, Christ is the key to canonicity. Let's look now at this other section where we have some problems with something called the redactional view of canonicity. You may not be familiar with the word redaction or redactor or redactional. I'll define that in just a minute, but before we do, the little paragraph at the beginning says, canonicity is determined by God and only recognized by the people of God. The basic test for canonicity is propheticity. That is, a book was recognized by the people of God if it was known to come from a prophet of God. But there are those in the theological fields who say, well, all of these things that we have in the Old Testament, the books of Moses and the books of the law, the prophets and the books of the writings and so on, we do not believe were really written by the people who said they were written by, or if they were, there were substantial changes made down here, chapters or all kinds of changes freely made by these other people. And some of those people that say that believe that these are called inspired redactors. That is to say, they would call them inspired redactors. In other words, they believe the Holy Spirit used someone to make great changes in the Bible as time went on. What we're going to look at is first the support that has been offered for this view. Then over here in a little bit we're going to look at the objections to this view. And then we'll see, I think, that there are some real problems with this idea. First, let's look at the redactional canon theory. We'll see what it is, and we'll see what some of the support for it is. Someone after Moses, number one, possibly Joshua, wrote the last chapter of Deuteronomy, since it is not prophetic and it records Moses' death. That's one of, they're trying to build a case here. By the way, we freely admit that, and we'll look at that in just a minute when we look at the reaction to these. Number two, certain sections of Deuteronomy show evidence of a later redactor because they are editorial in nature, and they refer to a later time when Israel was in the land of their possession, as that section says in Deuteronomy. Number three, the arrangement of Psalms into 5 books is undoubtedly the work of editors. Number four, Proverbs passed through the hands of editors after Solomon, some of whom lived in Hezekiah's day, 200 years after Solomon. Number five, some books, such as Jeremiah, survive, in other words, we have copies, in 2 substantially different versions. The longer Masoretic, and we'll talk who about the Masoretes were later, version is 1/7 larger than the shorter Septuagint, that's the Greek version of the Old Testament, which survives in a Hebrew fragment from the Qumran discoveries. And number 6, the books of Chronicles present themselves as being based on prior prophetic records, and they give a number of references here, which were redacted by the author or authors of Chronicles. And then finishing up this section, it says, in support of this redactional canon, Emmanuel Tav is often quoted. On the alleged redactions of Jeremiah, just as an example, he said, Editor 2, and that's from the Masoretic text, he believes, took the liberty of adding and changing many minor details and a few major ones. These changes are visible in 1, text arrangement, 2, the addition of headings to prophecies, 3, repetition of sections, 4, addition of new verses and sections, and 5, additions of new details, and 6, changes in content. And by the way, you can see the reference down here at the bottom if you'd like to read more about that from the liberal perspective. However, note at the bottom of that section, some redactional models have been proposed by even evangelical scholars. Now, evangelical scholars, from our viewpoint, mean those people who believe in inspiration. They believe in the virgin birth of Jesus. They believe in the resurrection. They believe in the soul and heaven and hell. But they are not people who often take the Bible literally for what it teaches. They would say, for example, some of them would say, for example, that the first 11 chapters of Genesis are put in there to tell us sort of a lesson about how wonderful it was that God had something to do with our existence. But they do not believe, for example, some of them do not believe that God really created the world in a short period of time, and there was really an Adam and Eve in a garden, and they were tempted by the devil using a snake, and so on. And so those people are called in the theological circles evangelicals, and he names some of them. And then he says that one of them says that the books of the Bible seem to have gone through an editorial revision after coming from the mouth of an inspired spokesman. In the same passage, he speaks of later editorial activity, and he claims we have evidence of redaction over at least 2 millennia, that's 2,000 years, from 1800 BC to 200 BC, to AD 200. However, there have been a number of people who have objected to this, and what we'd like to do now is to look at the objections to the redaction canon theory. I might mention that in Harris's book on the inspiration and canonicity of the Bible, as we start this section, he said, if the literal truth of the Bible books is denied, the chief criterion for the assemblage of the books is abandoned, and the problem of the canon returns with new force. In other words, he says, if the books are not like they claim to be, if they were not written by the authors that claim to have written them or are accredited to have written them by other authors of the Bible, and so on, then really the canon is up in the air. We have no clue which books go in the Bible and which don't. And so, using his idea as sort of a basis, let's look at some of the objections to this. Reading under the heading there, it should first be noted that none of the arguments advanced in support of the inspired redaction view of the canon is definitive. Really not any of those things that we just read, those 6 arguments that are listed, is really a definitive evidenced argument. All of them are capable of explanation in view of the prophetic view presented earlier in this chapter. So let's look quickly at these responses to the redaction canon argument. Number 1, that Moses might not have written the account of his own death has long been accepted by conservative scholars and by really anyone who has studied the information on that. You remember we talked about that as the colophon principle earlier, and we used a quotation from Harris. As a matter of fact, if you look back on page 242, down at the bottom of page 242, there's a little quote there, and he explains the way that one writer who was going to be taking the place or filling the position of the previous writer would close out the books of the previous writer, and in this case, for example, with Joshua closing out the death of Moses, would have been just a logical thing. And by the way, we found that in secular literature. We know that that was a common way of doing that at that period of time. Then on the next page, 252, the parenthetical sections in Deuteronomy 2 need not be non-Mosaic simply because they are editorial. And editorial means a guy makes a comment about something that he is saying there, just like an editorial on a newscast. A man may be making a newscast and then he wants to give an editorial about what he thinks about that. Well, Moses did that. Authors often use editorial material in their own writings. And when Moses said, the land of their possession, does not have to imply that they had already gone in and possessed the land. Read with me this little quote from Keil and Delitzsch, a commentary on the Old Testament, that says, the land to the east of the Jordan, where Moses and the children of Israel were at that time, which was conquered by the Israelites under Moses, that's before they crossed the Jordan, and divided among the 2 tribes and a half, and which is also described in chapter 320 as the possession which Jehovah had given to these tribes, would have been a normal way for Moses to identify where he's talking about over here. And I've put down in this next part that says, even if there are later additions, they may possibly be uninspired changes that are subject to the same textual debate as Mark 16, 9-20, and John 7, 53 through 8:11. Now, let me just pause for 2 things on this. Number 1, it is possible for a scribe to put something in a manuscript that we have today that was not originally there, and it's been copied and recopied and recopied and handed down to us. Please hold on to that idea. We'll talk about that in future chapters in this same course. But I would suggest that a person who has not studied this and just reads that is very shocked, perhaps, to find Mark 16, 9-20 is listed as an uninspired writing, or John 7, 53, 8-11. If you'd like to jump ahead and look in the textual criticism section of this book, you may do so and read about those, although I disagree with the conclusion that Geisler and Nix make on Mark 16, 9-20. And so I suggest to you that we would not use, this would be a poor refutation, in my view, to this particular one here. I prefer the one that Keil and Delitzsch come up with, which I believe is correct, and is provable, by the way. Number 3, simply adding and rearranging inspired writings, such as the individual Psalms, is not proof of the the redaction model. Adding Psalms to the Psalter as they were written fits perfectly with the prophetic model of the canon. In other words, somebody writes it, they put it in. It's canonical. So there's really not a problem with that. Now, you see, that's a misunderstanding that some people have. Look at this next few lines here. What the redactional model would have to prove is that later allegedly inspired editors made deliberate changes in the content of the Psalms or any other book already in the canon, and not just rearrange what was there. I mean, we've rearranged every book in the Bible just about. That doesn't have anything to do with the content of it. And if you go back and study the history of the arrangement of the books, you'll see that they've gone in just about every order that you can imagine. And also look at the footnote down here at the bottom. The evidence, there is no proof of such content changes in the Psalms. The evidence for this was provided by Kenneth Barker in response to Waltke's proposal. And on page 251, there is a footnote about this, and you can go back and read more on that if you want to. That's all included on those footnotes on the previous page. So, number 3 gives an explanation about the Psalms. Number 4, none of the passages cited from Proverbs prove that the original author's writing, whether Solomon's, Agur's, or Lemuel's, was not accepted by the believing community immediately and continued subsequently without deliberate content changes. The word or phrase copied out that's found in the King James Version does not mean changed in content, but merely transcribed from one manuscript onto another. And that has nothing to do with changing content. Number 5, conservative scholars have long acknowledged that there may have been 2 versions or editions of Jeremiah. One that came from Jeremiah himself, on which the Septuagint is based. The LXX is the abbreviation for the Greek version of the Old Testament called the Septuagint. And a later one on which the Masoretic text is based, with more of his prophecies collected by his scribe Baruch. Thus there is no need to suppose or posit a later inspired redactor of Jeremiah after his time. Baruch was Jeremiah's co-worker and his scribe. And finally, number 6, the passages cited in Chronicles do not mean that the writer of Chronicles, who possibly was Ezra, was redacting some other books, but merely that he was using them as sources to write his own book. For example, Daniel in chapter 9 uses Jeremiah 25. 2 Samuel 22 uses Psalm 18. Further, it is not necessary to take all the books of Chronicles, all the books Chronicles cites as inspired writings. Some were simply court records. The books by Samuel the seer and Nathan the prophet may be prophetic writing now known as 1 Samuel. Still others may have been uninspired commentaries like 2 Chronicles 13:22. And again, that would be no different today than someone quoting me or you if you made some comment that was true, like 2 + 2 is 4, and put it in there even though that would not substantiate the fact that I was inspired or that you were inspired. And so now we've seen some of the objections to this. In our next lesson, we will look at the problems with the redaction canon theory, because this is not a sound theory at all, and then we will conclude our chapter on the development history of the Old Testament canon.